So given that we know that people who come into the organization cynical can develop poor quality relationships with their supervisors, also have perceive poor exchange qualities, perceive less support from their organization, we wanted to figure out whether or not individuals could be predisposed to be cynical. Up to this point, the research had said it's all organizational experiences. The short answer is yes, they can. What we found is that people who view themselves negatively, so people who have low self-esteem, people who have an external locus of control, people who are generally high in negative affect, sort of glass half empty people, tend to be higher in organizational cynicism. However, we also found that supervisors who provide support, who provide developmental opportunities and good feedback, actually mitigate the expression of cynicism. So what can organizations do? Do not do this. The tendency is often to ignore the negative, right? Somebody's being critical, and consistently critical, we'll just put them aside. Let's focus on the positive. Our research would suggest, in fact, that isn't necessarily the right tactic. So practical implications. Do encourage supervisors to sort of look beyond the negative. Do encourage them to try and develop high-quality relationships with all employees, to look beyond the cynicism, to provide support and encouragement. Do stress objectivity in subordinate evaluations. And then finally, encourage follow-through on initiatives. If you say that you're going to do something, try and do it. Match actions and words. And that will help, if not mitigate, lessen the expression of cynicism.
It's interesting, as you were saying that, I was thinking of empowerment, because so often when you're thinking about performance in an organization, you're thinking about performance, engagement, but empowerment is such a huge kind of that, having some kind of control, and I saw it somewhere in there, that cynics feel a lack of control, which is why they're always kind of like reacting, so don't hurt me, don't hurt me. So the more information you give to someone, the more empowered they may feel over their reality or the way they react to the reality, and that can help.
I think it can. That lack of control really is one of the things that fosters and breeds the cynicism. I don't feel I have control over everything, so I'm just gonna pull back, as you said earlier, so I don't get hurt. So my expectations are met on a very low level rather than having these high expectations and having them not be met.
What my research shows is that idealized influence leaders, they promote forgiveness following workplace mistreatment, and they suppress revenge following workplace mistreatment, and they do that by heightening followers' collective identity. So by making those collective interests more salient in their minds. So, why should we care about this research? Well, interpersonal conflict is just inevitable in organizations. It's happened all the time. The prevalence rates of mistreatment are increasing year by year. So a key challenge for managers and leaders is to ensure that they find ways to help employees deal with those feelings of injury and betrayal that just come with mistreatment in ways that are beneficial for the organizations and the people that get hurt. So we want to make sure they find ways to help them repair that sense of group functioning and interpersonal relationships. And one way they can do that is by fostering idealized influence leadership, so by engaging those kind of behaviors I talked about earlier. Now, our model also suggests that really any intervention that heightens followers' collective identity can have the similar kind of effects I've talked about here in terms of idealized influence in promoting forgiveness and suppressing revenge. So things like team-based work structures or organizational cultures that emphasize interdependence, they can all work in promoting forgiveness.
If I brought this back, and I'd be curious what others' views are, to the workplace I'm in, I think the first reaction would be from individuals, well, yeah, I hear what you're saying theoretically, but no one here forgives that in that way. If you're asking me to do that as a manager or as an employee, what's that going to do to my power if I'm in a managerial position? What about my authority? I mean, if forgiveness is seen to be a sign of weakness in my culture, and if forgiveness is contrary to the typical or management style or leadership style in the organization, which is much more about showing authority, am I actually, I know this is the reaction I would get from some managers, is I don't want to do that. I'm going to diminish my power and authority both with my staff and my peers, and therefore it's going to work against me as an individual. So I get why for the greater good, this may be the right thing to do. But I'm not going to be the first to go and do that because it's going to harm me as an individual. It's an interesting question, I think.
Yeah, no, I think it is an interesting question, and I think it's important to create a culture of forgiveness, a climate of forgiveness. It's not, so it's the norm, you know? If you are that one person who does it, you're right, you might get taken advantage of and be thought of, as somebody who's weak. But that you shouldn't be the only one, right? So I think if you set up practices and structures in place, including leadership, that promotes these things, then you're not going to be that one oddball. You're going to be one among many that promotes this, and ultimately everyone's going to benefit.
So what can we do from an organizational standpoint? Some suggestions out there: prohibit it. You can't use Facebook at work. You can't bring your own device. How do you think that's going to sit with those college students that are coming in that are spending 9 hours on their phones? That's one approach. Set the culture. The expectation is that you don't have to respond right away. You don't have to respond on weekends. And you lead by example with that. And a big part is also building awareness and realizing that there are those negative consequences that cause stress, and having open discussions about that within the workplace. So those are some initial things that you can consider to help to cope with the effects of technostress. I'm sure we've all experienced this. Our people that are important to us, our significant others, our friends, our family, are having a conversation and they're doing this. Yep. So they are actually snubbing you through their phone, something that's called phubbing. And you take this a step further, this concept of techno-ruptions, and within the workplace, if you are in a work meeting and one person disconnects because they're on their phone or they're on their devices, what does it mean for those around them? What does it mean for the actual performance of that meeting and the kinds of relationship that they have around those meetings? So that's something that we're getting into very heavily right now with quite a large research grant. If we talk about coping, it's a question mark here because really the research is not there yet. If you try to apply what we talked about in technostress to secondhand technostress, do you prohibit it? Do you say, all right, meetings, phones are out of sight? Awareness building, having that conversation, there's some initial indications that it does change by gender and by age as well. And again, leading by example. You don't have that phone there in that meeting.
Addiction is probably a real thing, but I have to tell you, our employees feel panicked without their devices. We may begrudge the fact that we have to use them and they interrupt our day. My employees go nuts without it and feel panicked. So I guess first question is, you talked a little bit about gender. Do you think there is a generational impact, and do you think it's different generationally? Because that's my theory, but what was your research say?
So it's a matter of how do you strike that balance within the workplace? How do you make sure that you are enabling the younger generation to work how they need to work to become most productive, to become happy in their workplace, but then be mindful of the other generations who are getting really stressed out when they're trying to have that conversation with the younger generation set and they're on their phones and they don't understand that because it's a very different kinds of mindset. So how do you strike that balance so that you're not causing inadvertently stress to those by allowing the younger generation to do what they need to do? So it's a very complicated question, and a lot of it comes down to how do you have that discussion? And how do you understand the viewpoints and the concerns and the expectations and the values that different generations have within the workforce and how they view technology?